what is the form-based code and what it looks like. In the early years, there was actually a long and vigorous debate, a noisy debate among the founders of the Form-Based Codes Institute, seeking to define and refine the practice together. What's most important? How's a code different from a vision or guidelines document? Here's the definition we eventually derived. A method of regulating development to achieve a specific urban form. Now, there's a lot there, but regulating, it means these are the rules. These aren't just suggestions, these are the rules. And specific urban form, we're not talking about just the individual building anymore. We're talking about how buildings go together in a set as urbanity. Form-based codes create a predictable public realm by controlling physical form primarily and land uses secondarily through city or county regulations. Predictability. It's because we believe that uncertainty is the enemy of reinvestment in our cities. We need the predictability. Public realm, because the form-based code is most concerned on how buildings go together in a set and reinforce one another, less concerned about what's going on inside the private spaces within a building. Controlling physical form primarily and land uses secondarily. There's a little myth busting there. We often hear people ask, well, if you're doing form-based code, does that mean you don't care at all about land use? And of course we care about land use. We just don't use land uses as the organizing principle and the dominant factor in a form-based code. Instead, the dominant factors are physical form. And then last, through city or county regulations. This means a form-based code, as we define it, is actually adopted by a local government and given the force of law. Now, there are three interrelated concerns which come up every time in the making and maintaining of place. One is form, the other is use and density, as we just talked about, and the third is management. So under form, we might be concerned about the building to street relationship or the skyline of a place or the compatibility of things. In use and density, we probably want to be careful to make sure that that toxic use, which once poisoned the neighbors before conventional zoning, doesn't come back in and among the housing or the places where kids are playing and poison us again. So of course we're concerned about certain segregation of land uses. Noxious uses need to be pushed away from our homes. Last, management. There's a whole class of activities local governments are accustomed to enforcing, like noise ordinances and parking regulations that have to do with the use of the place over time. Now, in conventional zoning, the land use and density intensity calculation dominates the proceedings. It is the organizing principle behind the zoning. So that's why the zones are commercial zones or residential zones or office zones, industrial zones, and so on. Management plays a big role because local governments love to squabble over things like that noise ordinance or light pollution ordinances, and that's important. And then way down in the corner, a little bit about form, usually just as an after effect of things like regulating setbacks to push buildings behind a certain theoretical line. Now, when we make a form-based code, we turn this around and we say the form comes first. This is the organizing principle. It has the most attention in the code, while management and land use are still there and still important. I'm going to do a little comparison now between conventional zoning and the form-based codes. In the map that goes with a conventional zoning ordinance, you typically will have big blobs of color, red for commercial, yellow for residential, and so on. And there's very little detail. Lots of the addresses within a blob are dealt with exactly the same way with exactly the same rules. In form-based codes, we usually find a great deal more detail. The addresses themselves are broken down, so Main Street is not dealt with the same way and ruled the same way as Elm Street. This picture shows in one photograph why we think predictability is a big problem with conventional zoning. The zoning here, voluminous, it goes on, page after page of tight regulations for this place, actually can generate either building you see here. This is a real unretouched photograph of buildings that exist across the street from one another in a small town downtown. And the older building on the left has one kind of relationship to the street and public space. Arguably, the one on the right has no relationship. Well, if the zoning can give you either building, is it really giving you that predictability in the public realm that makes for great addresses being maintained over time? So here's the point. The building to street relationship is the most important thing we regulate in form-based codes. There's a kind of grammar in the architecture, in the position of the building on its lot, that gives the street a shape. And here on a classic Main Street, you see one kind of shape. You're actually seeing the space of the street given a form, like a public room with walls. That's usually the building faces or the trees, and a floor. That's the sidewalks and motorways in the center of the street. That shape is the thing that the form-based code tries to get right first. And that's because the sense of place often derives from giving that spatial coherence to the place. And different proportions are possible. When you get really wide height to width ratio, the sense of place tends to diminish. So that's why form-based codes try to articulate carefully what that relationship should be on any given street. Not that they're all the same. The building to street relationship can vary a lot from one place to another. It could be like these in these pictures, or like these, or any number of other variations. Here, for example, on the picture on the left, there's a very shallow dooryard, all of which is taken up by the porch. In the picture on the right, there's a very shallow dooryard and a very small stoop and no porch. So the relationship here is coming partly from architecture, partly from the location of the finished floor, and partly from the distances between things, like from the edge of the sidewalk back to the building face. Or here's a dramatically different one. Again, a designed building to street relationship, this one designed by the great town planner John Nolan. But the buildings are set back behind deep front yards, even to the point where in this photograph we don't see the houses. What we see instead are the trees, which Nolan, in his code for this place, very carefully regulated. So the key to this is to know where you are and to build that way. I like to say context is everything. And so we go out and we study the context. We take photographs of it, we measure it, we write down the dimensions of everything we can see, and we try to discover what that grammar is that makes a place unique. And this is different in each region, in each architectural tradition. And so it's really something that has to be observed anew in every new project. You'll hear form-based codes enthusiasts speak about the transect. This is a simple idea. Again, know where you are and build that way. It says that if you're in the rural part of that range from rural to urban, there's a different building to street relationship. And as we move toward the center of the metropolis, buildings tend to come closer, they tend to be more attached to one another. And there's a whole range of these human habitats in between. This is an idea that comes from naturalists. Early planners like Patrick Geddes adapted the work that naturalists and observers of biology and geography were documenting and said, well, if we can slice the natural world into these different kinds of zones, or ecotones they call them, surely we could do the same thing with human habitats and understand that different grammar from urban to rural, or even within a given neighborhood from its center to its edge. And there's a lot more variety possible when we study this and apply the transect idea than, say, just one big blob of yellow on that whole area of the map and calling it a subdivision. How are these form-based codes being actually used on real places? The variety is astonishing. They are being used to regulate development in downtowns, not too surprising. They're also being used to regulate new development in infill locations and brownfield sites, on skipped over real estate where new neighborhoods are growing, and in the places where historic buildings are being replaced with new ones and the gaps between buildings on Main Street are filled in gradually. They're being used in so-called greenfield developments, that is, new towns or new neighborhoods outside of the historically settled urban area. They're being used in newly created transit-oriented development, where local governments are grappling with densities and intensities that are much greater than they did before, and they need to get the form right so that that walkable environment around the new transit station has the coherence it needs. And last, they're being used in retrofitting suburbia. As we kind of transition from a coarse-grained suburban environment to a more fine-grained one with greater sustainability focus, we need a different set of tools. Retrofitting suburbia seems to be one of the most fertile places to apply the form-based code, because much of suburbia was built according to the conventional zoning form-based codes seek to correct.